For the third part of this lecture, we'll be talking about knowing ourselves by observing our own behaviors. Let's start off with self-perception theory. This is the theory that when our attitudes and feelings are uncertain or ambiguous, we infer these states by observing our own behaviors or actions in a specific situation in which it occurs. Now, this doesn't apply if we're completely certain about our feelings and attitudes. So, for example, one might be completely sure on their stance in the pro-choice, pro-life argument, and they don't need to infer any situational context based on where they stand. Yet, one could also be unclear, for example, on the use of nuclear power as a fast transition energy source to move from fossil fuels to more sustainable sources. So for this latter one, where we're unclear on where our feelings actually lie, it's possible that we would examine previous discussions we've had around this and then decide what our feelings actually were based on perhaps our stance in those discussions. Talk a little bit about motivation now, and motivation can be thought to come in two broad flavors, and this is largely determined on where the sort of locus is or the origin of that behavior arises. The first is intrinsic motivation, and this is the desire to engage in an activity because we enjoy it or find it interesting, and not because of some external rewards or pressures. Conversely, there's extrinsic motivation, which is the desire to engage in an activity because of external rewards or pressures, and not because we actually find the task enjoyable or interesting. Now, it should be noted that if you're going to go and study motivation, that extrinsic motivation can oftentimes be divided into 4 different categories, and each of those ranges by how external the control for that behavior is, with the lowest being completely externally driven by, say, pay or rewards, and the furthest above or the closest to intrinsic motivation is where we have begun to internalize a motivation, even though it began with certain types of rewards. We will not really cover that in this text, though. It should also be noted that for any given behavior, these two forms of motivation tend to be inversely proportional. And what I mean by this is that the higher one type of motivation is to contributing to a certain type of behavior, the lower the contribution of the other type of motivation will be. So most things in life are not going to be just completely one or the other, such that our motivation is completely intrinsic or extrinsic, but rather it will be some combination of both of these. But the more of one we have, the less of the other we're likely to find for that same specific behavior. Now, this sort of relationship between them leads to something called the over-justification effect, and this refers to the tendency for people to view their behaviors as caused by compelling extrinsic reasons, making them underestimate the extent to which it was caused by intrinsic reasons. And ultimately, this will result in a decrease in intrinsic motivation for any specific behavior over time in which some kind of extrinsic or external reward is regularly given. Basically, what this means is you can start doing something because you love to do it, and someone recognizes your skill at doing it and so begins to give you rewards for doing it. Over time, after receiving those rewards, your initial love and intrinsic motivation for that behavior will begin to wane and decrease over time, so long as you continue receiving those rewards. Unfortunately, when you no longer receive those rewards, your intrinsic motivation will not snap back. In fact, it can be, in many cases, permanently reduced over the duration of continually receiving extrinsic rewards. It should also be noted that while not technically speaking impossible, it is incredibly difficult to regain intrinsic motivation after it has been sort of supplanted or replaced with some form of extrinsic motivation, where one is now getting rewards. So just as a personal life note here, be wary when people tell you to find a job that you do because you love whatever it is you do. Over time, while you might originally love it, if you do get paid for it for long enough, chances are that you might not love to do whatever that is as much as you originally did. I'm not saying that you won't love to do it over the course of 30 years, that your average profession will last, but it will probably not be as great as when you started. No, excuse me. Conversely, though, you can use this sort of internal brain shuffling to your advantage. If you spend a significant amount of time working hard for something and not really getting extrinsic rewards for it, you will actually convince yourself that you love whatever it is that you just spent all this time doing. And while this might sound like a strange manipulation, you yourself are not consciously aware of this happening, and it just sort of takes place as one of those underlying mechanisms of our brain. A place where you see this quite often is if you maybe have ever wondered to yourself why so many volunteers are so gung-ho and hardcore believers in whatever it is they're doing to save the world or make a change. While some of them genuinely felt like that when they started, many people who volunteer spend an incredible amount of time volunteering with little to no reward whatsoever, be it financial or in social recognition. In fact, just think about how many volunteers we routinely ignore when they're trying to ask us to either pay attention to refugee crises or environmental catastrophes, or even just the untold numbers of people who volunteer at soup kitchens and hostels and who receive really not much in return. Over time, one will actually begin to more and more like whatever it is that one is doing, and this is how we justify all of the effort that has been put into this task. Because if you spend an extra 20 hours on top of an already insane work week volunteering at, say, a soup kitchen, the only way you can really make sense of this when you critically examine it is that you must love it, else why would you do it since you're not getting something for doing so. Another little bit of life advice that was once passed on to me by also a psych professor that I'm happy to pass on to you. If ever you are one day looking for a life partner or just some good friends, I highly recommend volunteering somewhere because you will find other people who are one like-minded and two actually give a shit about something that you probably also care about, hence the reason for volunteering at that specific place. It is actually a really good way to make friends and help communities. Here's an empirical example of this overjustification effect. Was a study conducted by Green, Sternberg, and Lepper in 1976 and is referred to as the overjustification in a token economy. So here the participants were 4th and 5th graders, and the dependent variable here was how long they spent playing a math game. I'm not sure if the math game was on a computer or not, but seeing as how it was 1976, probably not a computer. So for the 13 days, or the first 13 days, they were allowed to just play this game as long as they wished, and they didn't really get anything for it, which is one of the other things they had access to, and they spent some time during their day playing this game. Afterwards, they then received a reward for playing this game. The way the reward worked is for however long they played the game, they received credits, and based on those credits, they could use those to exchange them for either prizes that were kind of certificates or trophies or something to that effect. They did this for an additional 13 days. Following this, they had another 13 days of ultimately free play where they received no credits or tokens for their playing, and it was like that first original block of 13 days where it was available to them if they so choose, but they did not have to and received nothing for doing so. Here in the graph you can see what happened. So this first jagged line here represents the first block of 13 days, and the y-axis here is the number of minutes on average the student spent per day playing this video game. And you can see that it started and ranged between 15 and 25 minutes, and so it's sort of, if you wanted to estimate, probably an average of about 20 minutes over the course of this one day less than 2 weeks. This next line here represents once they began receiving their rewards, and you can see that there is, while subtle, it is a significant increase in the number of minutes they spent playing every day on average for the next 13 days. So here you can see the effect of the reward incentivized behavior, and they were more likely to do so. This next block here represents once the reward was removed, and here you can see immediately there is a drastic drop in how much they played the games. It did increase for a little while, but after that it is pretty much a steady decline in the amount of games that they played. The main thing to pay attention to here is the stark difference between this line here and this line here. They went from this being the average sort of measured intrinsic motivation they had to play this game. They played this freely for nothing, only their own will and wishes, which hypothetically should have been present here as well. But you can see that the reward being given severely degraded the degree to which they played the game freely. Another very famous example of this was actually conducted in Brooklyn, where they were worried about reading proficiency, and the school districts came up with the idea of having students read books, report that they had read a book, and they received $5 for every book that they read. And basically, exactly the same pattern was observed. For about 6 months, while they were able to give these $5 rewards, reading rates went up significantly. But as soon as the experimenters ultimately ran out of money, or maybe it was, how should we say, a civic situation in which they got some money from who knows where and used it, they ultimately ran out. And afterwards, they found that reading rates actually plummeted below where they originally were. So not only did people who did not really care about reading, who were reading for the reward, stop reading again, but even those people who originally just read because they enjoyed reading began to receive rewards, and after the reward was removed, they did not read as much as they did originally. There are some caveats to this. First, of course, one must possess some manner of intrinsic motivation in the first place for the rewards to reduce. If you have no intrinsic motivation whatsoever to do something, then giving rewards to someone can be an effective way to get them to engage in the behavior. Just be aware that they're unlikely to continue that behavior once the reward has been removed. There is actually a lot of literature on this if you would like to pursue it further. And you can always take the motivation class that I believe is still offered by Professor Jim Halligan, who is also just a great professor if you ever want someone who actually cares about his students. Another thing that makes a big difference is the type of rewards that one receives. And again, just so that you are aware, there are actually far more reward systems or methods of giving rewards than just these two talked about here. But these are the ones referenced in your books, so we will talk about these. Task contingent rewards are rewards given whenever you have completed some task. This is the equivalent of a participation trophy. You took part, you get a reward. That's as simple as it is. Whether you did great, whether you did poorly, it doesn't matter at all. This type of reward structure tends to reduce intrinsic motivation fairly quickly, because you're pretty much just always getting a reward, and there is really no incentive to do any kind of hard work because you will get the reward, and that reward ultimately then has more sort of salience to us than our own internal feelings as to why we were doing it in the first place. Contrasted with this is performance contingent rewards, and these are rewards given based on how well a task was performed. So grades would be something like this. It is a reward you're given based on how well you do. I mean, you could argue that that's not the true meaning of grades, but most people don't look at that meaning anymore. For now, there is this large obsession with getting A's, for example, as opposed to using grades as a metric to evaluate how well you were doing and to specifically then focus your future efforts on where you need to spend additional time to improve. Nowadays, most grades are not looked at like that. They are simply just, well, things that people need to satisfy in order to continue on with their life, which is sad but also understandable in the one, political, and two, educational climate we find ourselves in. Generally speaking, performance contingent rewards will not significantly reduce intrinsic motivation, though it will to some degrees, and there are different situations in which it does more so than others. A specific instance of this is that giving performance contingent rewards can oftentimes lead to a feeling of anxiety centered around being evaluated, and it can put increased pressure on people by exactly that same token, right? You see in today's world that you're not allowed to get a C almost anymore, even though originally a C meant average, which meant most people should actually get C's. But if you tell students that nowadays, that's completely alien to them, because many people have this, ultimately, I'm sorry to say, misguided perception that A's are what is regular and expected, And B's and C's are almost not a good thing, but technically it used to be that you would only get an A for truly outstanding work, not something you could just come to class and expect to get one. Anyway, I'm getting off track with that. But those grades can ultimately be tremendous pressure on students, and that pressure can remove intrinsic motivation once again, even though the original reward structure did not do so to the same degree as task contingent rewards. And so it needs to be administered in a very careful manner. Ultimately, it seems like if you need to give feedback to someone, but you also don't want to reduce their motivation tremendously, it seems like providing positive feedback that is specifically focused on how they're improving and what they can do to further improve is far more effective at maintaining motivation than praising their accomplishments or achievements. Ultimately, that makes people again focused on getting accolades and praise for completing things and not for the process, and that leads to ultimately less effort expended to many difficult tasks. This leads nicely into mindsets, and mindsets are a related concept that was originally put forward by a psychologist named Carol Dweck, and they're ultimately two classes and are defined as follows. Fixed mindsets are mindsets centered around the idea that we have a set amount of an ability of some sort and we cannot change this amount of ability. Many people view intelligence in this manner. Some people are intelligent and other people are not. And it's actually not quite that simple, but that doesn't change the fact that many people hold this perception. Conversely, growth mindsets are mindsets centered around the idea that our abilities are malleable qualities that can be cultivated, developed, and grow. Now, it is important to note that while on average people will have one mindset or another, there can be specific nuances where there are certain types of things in the world that we perceive with fixed mindsets and others with growth mindsets. This is one of the reasons I use the example of intelligence, because even people who have predominantly growth mindsets will still to some degree look at intelligence, again on average, as being something that is immutable and cannot change. But this is ultimately not really the case, because intelligence is tested based on certain specific types of problem solving and association skills, all of those which, as I said, are skills and therefore can be practiced. Generally speaking, those with fixed mindsets are much more likely to give up after setbacks and will spend less time developing their skills and abilities than those with growth mindsets. And if you look at the definitions, this should make some degree of sense. So if I fail at something and I have a fixed mindset, I have failed because I do not have enough of whatever ability was required, and therefore I should stop trying because I will not be able to do it because I only had a certain amount of ability in the first place. This is like if I do really badly on an exam, I should just give up that entire class because I'm too stupid to ever actually do whatever it is that I'm trying to do, according to a fixed mindset perspective. Of course, that's a very extreme way of looking at it, but it illustrates the point quite well. Further, people with fixed mindsets, as mentioned, are less likely to practice their skills. So one of probably the most common that I see of this is having to do with math. Many people believe that they are just not math people and they will never have math aptitude. This is ultimately a fixed mindset way of looking at this. These people do not perceive math as a skill that can be practiced, and they fail to recognize when many people tell them that you must practice math over and over and over again, like pretty much any other skill, in order to become good at it. It is really the only way to become good at math unless you are a magical savant or prodigy of some sort, which I will be honest, there are incredibly few of them. Most people you see who are good at math because they've spent a long time practicing. Those who spend time practicing to improve their mathematical skills, or any other skills for that matter, are those who generally fall in the category of growth mindset people, because they believe that they can improve their abilities centered around math or whatever else they're trying to do. On an upside, some research has pointed to the possibility of being able to change one's mindset, meaning you can potentially go from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. I suppose the vice versa is possible too, but based on all the things I have said, I would be unsure of why you would want to move in that direction. Jumping a little bit away from motivations and impetus to engage in behaviors and moving on to emotions. So remember, we're knowing ourselves by observing our own behaviors. And so specifically here, we're looking at how can we evaluate or understand our own emotions when they are murky or complex. And so the sources of our emotions are not always clear. And in line with this is an emotion theory that posits the idea that emotional experience is a result of a two-step perceptual process in which people first experience some type of physiological arousal, right? Some type of arousal in our body. And please note that arousal need not be sexual arousal, right? You can be aroused in many, many ways. Many of them have nothing to do with sexual activities in any way, right? You can be terrified of something and you're physiologically aroused. Anyhow, you first experience some kind of physiological arousal and then seek some type of appropriate explanation for it. This is referred to as the two-factor theory of emotion. Please note, while we won't discuss them here, and we're discussing this particular theory of emotions because it fits very well with this section of the topic, there are several different competing theories around emotions and perceptions of emotions. Many of them are actually two-factor theories. The large difference among many of them is the difference in whether physiological arousal happens first, followed by some cognitive appraisal, meaning we explain it somehow, and others will say that there is some type of cognitive appraisal that arises first, followed by the appropriate physiological arousal. Like many things in science, especially in psychology, where things are ultimately quite complex, there is evidence that supports multiple theories, and no one theory has been reigned supreme over all of the others. Now, the idea here is that our appropriate explanation can change quite dramatically based on the environment in which we are feeling whatever it is we're feeling. There's a fun, cute little cartoon in your textbook that I highly recommend looking at. And if you're not really reading your textbook, even though I hope you are, sorry, I should just expect that you're all reading your textbooks and not make the assumption that you're not. Anyhow, so the way the picture goes is it states that one is feeling a state of physiological arousal, your heartbeat is pumping, your face feels flushed, your hands are shaking a little bit, they're a little bit sweaty as well. And now, what is it that you are feeling? And what you are feeling, or at least what experience you will tell yourself that you are feeling, is dependent on where you find yourself. If you are feeling all of those things and there's a grizzly bear in front of you, chances are you're feeling pretty terrified right now. If there is a very attractive person in front of you, well, then you're probably not feeling fear, even though you could be, and rather you're feeling something more analogous to desire or lustful feelings, or maybe even love, depending on, well, how long you've known that attractive person. If neither of those things are true and you have an exam to take for an incredibly strict professor in the next 5 minutes or so, chances are you're feeling anxiety about the exam instead of love or fear. Finally, if you have that same state of arousal and you're at the gym, you're unlikely to think that you're actually feeling an emotion because you're at the gym, and oftentimes when you're at the gym, you're physiologically aroused by very nature of what you're doing at the gym. So an important implication of this is that our emotional states are ultimately somewhat arbitrary, not completely, but to some degree arbitrary, because they're determined by the situation in which we find ourselves. And while this example made very clear-cut different situational contexts that could explain our emotional states, the real world is rarely as clear-cut, and there are often multiple conflicting reasons that could potentially explain our current state of physiological arousal. So an intriguing demonstration of this was conducted by Shakhtar and Singer. Shakhtar is one of the people who originally is involved in the creation of this particular brand of two-factor theory. It was conducted in 1963 and is referred to as, or is titled, Cognitive, Social, and Physiological Determinants of Emotional State. So in this experiment, Participants were told that they would receive a new form of a vitamin shot, so an injection, and they actually did get injections. And as wild as this may sound, only 1 in 185 of the participants actually refused to receive this injection. Of course, the injections were not vitamin supplements of any kind. They were either a placebo, which was probably some type of saline solution, right, a saltwater solution that you find in sort of rehydration bags at the hospital, or epinephrine, which is a, I believe, synthetic form of adrenaline. Now, among those who received epinephrine, half of them were told to expect that their hands would be sweaty and their face would be flushed and their heart would race, which is actually the effects of receiving a shot of epinephrine. And the other half were not actually told anything about the side effects that would occur after receiving this shot. So now you basically have three groups: a placebo group, an epinephrine group who was not told anything about it, and then also an epinephrine group who was told to expect the actual side effects that are likely to result. Now, I haven't read through the entire actual paper of this, but I believe that there was actually a fourth group in which they were misled about the side effects, but I won't go into that because I haven't actually yet read the paper fully. So after they received their shot, they were taken into another room where they were asked to fill out a survey, and next to them was another person also filling out the survey who was an accomplice of this experiment. And they were asked to fill out this questionnaire, and this questionnaire was ultimately highly personal and, well, somewhat insulting. The book provides one example question of this, which was asking people to report on how many people their mother had slept with before she had gotten together with their father. And that, I mean, during the times they weren't yet aware of, well, not necessarily aware, but it wasn't open to speak about relationships that were not across the standard gender binary. Anyhow, so you can imagine that these questions aren't the most fun things to think about, let alone to answer to give responses to somebody else. Fairly quickly after starting this part of the experiment, the accomplice gets really angry, tears up the sort of survey questionnaire, and then just leaves the room in a huff. And the question now is, what was the emotional state of the participants who had come in? The experiment found that those who had received the epinephrine shot and not been told about the side effects that they would receive reacted in the most angry manner. They got the most angry in response to this questionnaire and watching the accomplice leave in anger. Those who received the epinephrine shot but were told to expect the side effects experienced less anger than those who were not told about the side effects, and those who received the placebo group were ultimately in line with them also. Here, the placebo group had no arousal, so the expectation is that they should not have had any type of arousal to which to misattribute the source of their anger. Whereas the group that received the epinephrine but had an explanation for why they were feeling that state of physiological arousal should also have been able to avoid the sense of feeling anger because they knew a reason, a plausible reason for why they were in that physiological state of arousal, compared to the group in which nothing was told about the side effects that they would be feeling from this shot, and thus they misattributed that source of physiological arousal to their own state of anger. And this is ultimately what they saw. In the actual study itself, they supposedly also were able to manipulate euphoria, which is, they followed a very similar paradigm, but this time instead of an insulting questionnaire and instead of the person getting angry and ripping it up, they actually just rolled it into a paper ball and laughed around and enjoyed just sort of throwing it around and not really doing anything of seriousness. And they report that participants, when they were in this heightened state of arousal, were much more likely to take part in those sort of quote-unquote festivities and play along with the accomplice. Okay, just a quick side note here. So you might be a little bit shocked to know that in an experiment they gave some people just these random shots or injections of stuff, and you might be wondering how that was ethical, and you would be right to do so. Of course, well, there are some complications to this. So this has been replicated twice over the years as well, not that closely actually, Weirdly enough, one by Zimbardo, the one who was in charge of the Stanford prison experiment, and one actually by the grad student once they, I believe, got their doctorate, who actually reported on Zimbardo. So talk about crazy incidences of people who are unethical and or ethical doing weird experiments. Anyway, the grad student who reported Zimbardo for doing the unethical experiment or called it all to a stop conducted a similar experiment except used hypnosis to achieve the arousal states. And so there were some complications in direct comparison there because of how arousal led. And then Zimbardo tried to copy this, who was actually allowed to give epinephrine shots, but there they could not test this in the anger condition because ultimately there the IRB, I believe of Stanford at the time, argued that while the injection of epinephrine in itself is not unethical so long as you had, say, a doctor present and you had screened them for cardiac problems, eliciting anger in a participant was actually what was considered to be unethical. And so there are actually some complicated sort of discussions around the ethics of these types of experiments, and then whether we are able to effectively replicate them in the future, and what it means when we have incomplete replications that don't seem to support the same findings, and what that means for our ability to make conclusions around these types of theories. This is actually much more common than you would like to believe. Well, actually, I don't know that. It's more common than you may think. And not only is it in these very specific contexts around experiments that might seem unethical, and in some cases are unethical, but it also happens in just general day-to-day science. There is tremendous pressure on having sort of new and fancy and shiny experiments to publish as opposed to doing direct replications and copies of previous experiments. And so one of the hallmarks of science is repeating experiments over and over, and that actually doesn't get done as much as in some of the other hard sciences. Where, for example, in chemistry, most of the common and base experiments that build their theories are repeated thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times by almost every student who is pursuing that career. This is just yet another thing to think about. Almost to the end, we have misattribution of arousal. And this refers to the process where people make mistakes, especially when they're inferring what is causing them to feel the way that they do. And this is an incredibly common experience in everyday life because most everyday events in life tend to generate arousal, and for many of those events, the sort of driver or cause of that arousal is unclear, and it need not be only one source for that arousal. So your textbook has a very cute example of this, that you are at a movie next to, again, a hot date, and you are experiencing a degree of physiological arousal. But now, is this arousal due to the hot date who's sitting right next to you, or the scary nature of this movie, or just the fact that you ate too much popcorn and sugar, which could also lead to it. I mean, indigestion oftentimes can lead to certain amounts of physiological arousal. At the end of the day, it's hard to know for sure because we are not computers that get perfect percentage readouts of where all the various inputs are coming from. And at the end of the day, it can be from multiple sources. But when we conclude this about ourselves, we're loath to admit the nuance of where all it could come from, and oftentimes we'll fixate on one cause sort of above all others. A great empirical example of this, at least the idea, there's a relatively small sample size in the original study, which is actually something that's pretty common for many of these sort of quote-unquote foundational experiments. But nonetheless, it was a fun idea and has been replicated in multiple different ways over the course of the years. But please remember what I said about conceptual replications versus direct replications. Anyhow, Dutton and Aaron in 1974 have a paper called Some Evidence for Heightened Sexual Attraction Under Conditions of High Anxiety. And the primary location or the experimental condition for this experiment was conducted on a 450-foot long rope bridge that was constructed with wooden slats and rope for people to cross over. And it is over a canyon that has a 250 vertical foot drop to some fast-moving rapids underneath it. I believe it is in British Columbia. There were two experiments ultimately conducted. The first control or comparison is another bridge that was not scary. I'm assuming one that was solid and did not sway like the 450-foot one did in the middle. And the second control group was after they had crossed this sort of quote terrifying bridge and had maybe 10-15 minutes to just relax and calm down after crossing. So the way this worked is an attractive accomplice would approach people on the bridge, ensuring that the people they approached did not have someone of the same gender as the accomplice, and then they would ask if they would be willing to take part in a psychology experiment that the accomplice was conducting for their class. And this included something called the thematic perception test, or TAT, and this includes showing people multiple pictures of different people together and asking them to report on the nature of the relationship of those people in the pictures. And this can be given to people of all ages and genders because there are several different sort of stacks of these cards. This was then coded based on how sexual or platonic the people's explanations were of the relationships of these various people involved in these pictures. Further, at the end of the experiment, the accomplice would tear off a piece of the paper and write down their phone number on it and provide it to the participants if they would like to, or in effort to give them the opportunity to learn more information about the results of this experiment, if they of course accepted to take the phone number, which not everybody actually did. Now, what they found is that people had much more quote sexual content as rated by the judges in the responses for the thematic perception test, and were much more likely, I believe by double the amount, to call the accomplice after the fact to find out more and ostensibly ask them for, well, maybe some time out to go for a beer or something. Anyhow, so they found that people who were on that bridge, who were experiencing much more arousal, were more likely to believe that they were interested in this accomplice than when they had either rested after crossing the bridge or were on a non-physiological arousing bridge. And this was used to explain or support the idea that in a state of arousal, we're more likely to be able to misattribute that. So arousal of the bridge and its terrifying situation being misattributed to arousal arising from an attractive person who is talking to us. Now, the book states, and there are other well-known experiments that have shown this effect in women as well. This particular experiment actually had a male accomplice as well, who completed the same ultimately 2 experiments along with the female accomplice, but they did not find this effect in women at the time of conducting this original study.